This is Laura London, and you're listening to Speaking of Jung. Joining us today for episode 112 is Jungian analyst and scholar Craig Stephenson in Lisbon, Portugal. He earned a diploma in Analytical Psychology, which is the degree of a Jungian analyst, from the C.G. Jung Institute Zürich, and a doctorate from the Center for Psychoanalytic Studies at the University of Essex. Dr. Stephenson also trained in Group Psychotherapy, Sociometry and Psychodrama at the Institute for Psychodrama in Zümikon, Switzerland. He worked in private practice in Paris for 12 years and has served on the Ethics Committee and the Executive Committee of the Association of Graduates in Analytical Psychology and on the Board of Directors of the Philemon Foundation. Most recently, he worked as Director of Training of the Jungian Psychoanalytic Association in New York City. He is a certified Jungian analyst in New York State, a member of the Canadian Association for Psychodynamic Therapy, an associate member of the Canadian Psychological Association, and is qualified to work in Canada as a registered psychotherapist under the College of Registered Psychotherapists of Ontario. As an academic scholar interested in the history of psychological disciplines, he has published several books and articles, and edited original unpublished work by C.G. Jung for Princeton University Press. Dr. Stephenson's books are Possession, Jung's Comparative Anatomy of the Psyche, Anteros, A Forgotten Myth, Jung and Moreno, Essays on the Theater of Human Nature, On Psychological and Visionary Art, Notes from Jung's Lecture on Gerard de Nerval's Aurelia, Ages of Anxiety, Jung's Types as Inspiration for Poetry, Music, and Dance, and now The Correspondence of Victoria Ocampo, Count Kaiserling, and C.G. Jung, Writing to the Woman Who Was Everything, coming later this year from Routledge. On August 29th, he will be presenting a performed reading of his forthcoming book at the IAAP's 22nd International Congress in Buenos Aires. 3 Argentinian actors will perform in English a selection of the correspondence that preceded and followed the encounters told in the book. All of that and more are the subjects of our talk today. This interview is being recorded on Wednesday, July 27th, 2022, through the magic of Skype. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Stephenson.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be with you by Skype.
In the introduction, I mentioned that in addition to your degree as a Jungian analyst, you also earned a doctorate from the Center for Psychoanalytic Studies at the University of Essex. And when you and I spoke earlier, you mentioned to me that Jung is not taught in the U.S. and that the University of Essex is changing that. Would you tell us more about that?
Well, the Center for Psychoanalytic Studies at the University of Essex is the creation of a group of psychoanalysts who include Renos Papadopoulos and Andrew Samuels, who wanted to make a place for Jung in the English language academic world. Jung is read in academia in Italy, in Brazil, now I think in Japan, but in the English-speaking world, Jung is not very much part of academia. He's relegated sometimes to literary studies or religious studies, but not to psychology. And I think Andrew Samuels and Renos Papadopoulos and the other professors at the University of Essex have made a real effort to create a climate in which Jung can be discussed in the English language academic world. And it's a very important work that they've achieved in creating that space for Jung in academia.
Mm-hmm. And those two gentlemen that you mentioned are both Jungian analysts as well.
Yes.
And I'd like to discuss with you the difference between a Jungian analyst and a Jungian-oriented psychotherapist or a Jungian scholar. It seems like there's a lot of Jung out there, but there are not a lot of Jungian analysts. And that is one of the reasons why I created this podcast, was to feature the work specifically of Jungian analysts. So I'm very interested in understanding, or actually in hearing your take on what the differences are, how they're similar, and how they sort of coexist. Do you see where I'm coming from here?
Yes. I mean, I appreciate the question very much. It's not an easy one to answer because it depends a little bit on the context. Each country has a slightly different context. What I think you're talking about is the fact that to get a diploma in analytical psychology from an IAAP, an International Association of Analytical Psychology Training Institute, allows you to call yourself a Jungian analyst. There are lots of other kinds of training where one, as you say, one can receive a Jungian orientation in your training to become a therapist. But the IAAP trainings are quite specific and quite rigorous. At the time when I wanted to train, I'm from Canada. There was no training in Canada, and I had to choose between possibly traveling to the United States on weekends to train with the interregional program that was forming in the United States, or to travel to England or to Zurich and train at the institutes there. That has now changed in Canada. There is now a training program in Toronto. But there are also trainings for Jung, as you pointed out, for Jungian therapists, Jungian-oriented therapists, which are not IAAP training programs, and they're quite legitimate and quite important.
Mm-hmm. What is the difference between a Jungian analyst, training as a Jungian analyst, and training as a Jungian-oriented psychotherapist?
Again, I think it depends very much on where the training is taking place.
I ask you this because of your very diverse background. You are Canadian by birth. You were the training analyst in New York City at that group, and you practiced in Paris, and now you live in Portugal. And we have listeners all over the world. So I was hoping you would give us a sense for how it's different in different areas, what's involved, because I get these questions a lot, and sometimes I don't know how to answer people.
Well, it's a very difficult question to answer. I mean, just in terms of the general public knowing the difference between what is a psychiatrist, what is a psychologist, what is a therapist. You're asking a very refined question about what is the difference between training as an analyst in an IAAP program and training in a more general therapeutic training that might have a Jungian orientation. And I think it comes down to the fact that the IAAP has certain requirements for its training institutes all around the world. And so training institutes that want to be IAAP accredited have to meet certain standards. And those standards have to do with what students are required to read in terms of reading Jung, reading the primary sources, reading commentary on Jung, reading how the theory has moved forward and adapted itself to new times. And then the clinical requirements in terms of working with patients, in terms of completing supervision, writing up case reports, writing a thesis. So there are requirements that the IAAP want one to meet in order to become an IAAP Jungian analyst. But the word analyst is not controlled. So in the United States, for example, there are people who call themselves Jungian analysts who do not have an IAAP training, and the IAAP has not been able to control that designation. So that's where we get into gray areas. And in the United States, certain states have different regulations. I worked in New York City, and in New York State, Jungian analysts fall under the umbrella of licensed psychoanalyst. But in many states in the United States, psychoanalysis is not a controlled act. It's not controlled by government agencies. So you have to get a license as a social worker or as a marriage therapist. But psychoanalysis is not a designation which the state recognizes.
So what about the personal analysis that you must undergo while training to become a Jungian analyst? That, from what I understand, is not required to become a Jungian-oriented psychotherapist. But the IAAP training programs do require a personal analysis. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's correct. The two most important components I think of the training are the analysis, the personal training analysis, and the supervision.
I also would like to hear about the training, that might not be the right word, that you went through at the University of Essex to receive your doctorate. And aside from the personal analysis you went through in training to become an analyst, you also, like you mentioned, you read Jung, you studied Jung's works. So how was that different, or was it the same from what you studied at the University of Essex?
I studied at the Jung Institute in Zürich, so I was introduced to reading the collected works of Jung very intensively in Zürich for the years that I was in Zürich, 1993 to 1998. I would suggest that at the Jung Institute in Zurich, there was a kind of eclecticism. You got to hear many different perspectives. There was a kind of classical reading of Jung. There was a developmental reading of Jung. There were Hillmanesque archetypal readings of Jung. But at the University of Essex, what was emphasized was a kind of critical reading of Jung. And a real attempt to draw Jung forward into the 21st century. So perhaps less of a protecting Jung in his historical and cultural context as a Swiss man at the beginning of the 20th century. And saying, what is he good for now? And so there was, from an academic point of view, there was a real emphasis on the continuum of knowledge. That is to say, you would try to read all the commentaries on Jung up until the present day, and then your task as an academic was to summarize that and then critique it and then add to it to see what you could add to it, to the continuum.
How would you see individuals, academics who study Jung who have not been analyzed themselves? How could they, because I'm having a difficult time understanding that. I'm having a difficult time understanding the academic Jung and the, say, clinical Jung, the analytical Jung.
Well, when Jung wrote an essay, it often came out of a lecture he gave, and he would be speaking to a particular audience. So when he spoke to a group of medical doctors about schizophrenia, his language was different, his anecdotes were different, his approach was different. When he spoke at the Tavistock Clinic, he had a very particular style. When he spoke at the Psychology Club in Zurich, the style was very different. It was anecdotal. It was full of associations and amplifications. So Jung had many different voices. I think what happens in academic approaches to Jung is that those voices are analyzed and revalued. Somebody who's done beautiful work in that regard is Susan Rowland. Her work on Jung as a writer. That's an academic approach to looking at Jung. Leslie Gardner, who brought the theory of rhetoric to play. So she uses theory about rhetoric to approach her reading of Jung. So what academics do is bring a critical apparatus to the texts, and it's absolutely crucial that we have those opinions and those arguments about how Jungian texts work.
Being a Jungian analyst and practicing Jungian analysis and having yourself been analyzed, do you not see that as a prerequisite to understanding Jung? I guess I don't understand why, and I wanted to ask you because of your background, I don't understand why somebody would be an academic completely immersed in Jung without also being interested in being analyzed.
Well, I guess you would have to ask the academics who aren't analyzed. The ones that I know, have had experience working with therapists or analysts for the most part, mm-hmm. but it's not something that they're not clinicians and they're not interested in practicing as clinicians.
Mm-hmm. So you also trained, in addition to all of this, I find your background to be fascinating. In addition to that, you also trained in group psychotherapy, sociometry, and psychodrama at an institute in Switzerland called the Institute for Psychodrama. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, yes. In order to tell that story, I would have to go back a little bit.
Okay.
To begin with, I'm originally from London, Ontario, Canada, and before getting interested in Jung, I encountered Marion Woodman not as a Jungian analyst, but as an English teacher. She was my high school English teacher.
Oh, I didn't know that. I was wondering why you mentioned her in the acknowledgments to one of your books. I have it here in the notes. And so hopefully we'll get to that later. She was your high school English teacher. Wow.
Yes, before she trained as a Jungian analyst, she was my high school English teacher. And so in my last year of high school, I read Blake's Marriage of Heaven and Hell, Shakespeare's King Lear, Samuel Beckett's Endgame, and we were exploring these texts and also as theater. Mm-hmm. And her brother, Fraser Boa, was directing the theater and film department at the same high school.
Ah, wow.
And then after I graduated from high school, Fraser Boa and Marion Woodman went off to Zurich to train as analysts, and I kept in touch with them. Oh. And so they came back from Zurich to Canada, and with Daryl Sharp, mm-hmm. the three of them founded the Ontario Association, and so Daryl was my first analyst.
I didn't know that. I created this podcast in 2015 because of Daryl, because I had met him in Columbus, Ohio, when he came to the Jung House to give a weekend talk. And when I decided to create this podcast, I thought I'm going to interview all of Daryl's authors, all of the Inner City Books authors. So I went to Toronto, and he was my first guest. And then we did another episode together, and I still stay in touch. You know, he passed away a few years ago, and I still stay in touch with Scott Milligan, who took over Inner City Books, who was Daryl's longtime manager, and Daryl's family. I still keep in touch with them, and he lives on through this podcast. He was a very influential figure in my life. But yeah, thank you. Please continue.
Lovely. Well, I didn't know that story, Laura. So that's a wonderful connection. But just to say, when I went to university, after experiencing my last year of high school with Marion, I majored in English literature and psychology. So, so right from the very beginning, Marion's way of putting psychology and literature together was a huge inspiration for me and shaped my mind as an adolescent. So to say, I mean, my original degree, my honors bachelor's degree is in English literature and psychology. My graduate degree, my master's degree is in drama from the University of Toronto. So when I was at the Jung Institute in Zurich and training to be an analyst, I met Helmut and Eleanor Bartz. Now, Helmut and Eleanor Bartz were Jungian analysts, very much engaged in the work of the Jung Institute in Kuznach in Zurich. And at the same time, they had created an institute for psychodrama in their little neighborhood of Zümikon. And there was a group of Jungian analysts in training who worked with Helmut and Eleanor in group psychotherapy, sociometry, and psychodrama. And we were using drama as a tool to do active imagination. So we were a group of, say, 14 training candidates, working with the two leaders, with Helmut and Eleanor as the two directors, as co-directors. And so a protagonist, somebody would be chosen who might, for example, present a problem, or they might recount a dream. And then we would enact the dream with Helmut or Eleanor, usually Helmut, but not always. One of the co-directors would direct the scene, and the other co-director would be a kind of therapist who would stay at the side of the protagonist as he or she walked through the dream, asking questions, posing reflective comments, and just accompanying the person through the experience. So it was a kind of active imagination using theater. And it was incredibly rich and very evocative. And the book that I eventually edited, Jung and Moreno, was my attempt to honor the work of Helmut and Eleanor, putting Jung and Moreno, putting analytical psychology and psychodrama together.
Mm-hmm. You edited that volume subtitled Essays on the Theater of Human Nature. It was published in 2014, and I'll provide a link to that in the show notes. So you did that training at what point in the lineup? After your training as an analyst?
I started the training in psychodrama while I was training in Zurich, and then I continued the training after I left Zurich with the teacher who trained Helmut and Eleanor, a wonderful woman, Doreen Madden Alethery, who was an actress at the Abbey Theatre in Ireland, and who then moved to the United States and trained with Moreno at his institute, and so had firsthand experience with Moreno in the United States, and she was my teacher for the last 2-3 years of my training in psychodrama.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so you incorporate that in your practice as a Jungian analyst?
Yes, I do. It's a very powerful tool. And I must say that the word psychodrama now in the vernacular has a kind of negative connotation.
Yeah.
If you see it in a newspaper piece, it usually means somebody's acting out in a kind of history.
Right.
So in the 60s and 70s, I think psychodrama acquired a kind of negative connotation of a kind of acting out. But it can be used as a very important tool. So in a session with a patient in a clinical setting in a room, when there's just the two of you, yes, psychodrama can be used. And in the book, there's a beautiful chapter written by the Jungian analyst Christopher Beach from the United States about how to do that kind of work. And it can involve when somebody tells a dream, sometimes they don't remember the details very clearly. So if you slow down and you ask them to reconstruct the setting of the dream in the room using objects, using pillows, to say, well, there were 3 chairs in the room, and I'm going to put these pillows to represent the 3 chairs. And there was a woman standing off to the side, and I'm going to use this object to represent the woman. And you just sort of set it very slowly and concretely using your sensation function, reconstruct the dream, and that can really be a useful tool. Then you can invite the person to endow the objects, to stand behind an empty chair, and to endow the chair with the character that was in the dream, and so make the components of the dream really present, and then you can have a dialogue with those components of the dream. So, and that's very much what Jung was describing as active imagination. So it is a very powerful tool, and you don't use it with every patient, but it can be a really useful component of your toolkit as an analyst. Yes.
So the first book you wrote, titled Possession, Jung's Comparative Anatomy of the Psyche, that was originally published in 2009, and you had mentioned to me that was your thesis at the Jung Institute?
No, that was my thesis at Essex.
At Essex, I'm sorry. Okay, yeah, that's where you mentioned Marion Woodman in the acknowledgments, and I saw that, and I was going to ask you how you came to know her. I had no idea it went all the way back that far. That's wonderful. But something stood out to me that you mentioned in the introduction to that book that I'd like to ask you about. You say possession is a linchpin of Jung's analytical psychology. What do you mean by that?
Well,
switching gears here, sorry.
No. It's a linchpin is very small, but it's holding something in place which keeps the wheel moving forward. What I noticed just with regard to Jung's language, his vocabulary, is that when you read through the collected works, he uses typological language for a time, and then he drops it. He uses complex theory for a time, and then he drops it. He uses alchemical language towards the end of his life, and sort of stays with the alchemical language. But what I noticed was that if you track the word possession through the collected works, you'll see that it's a constant. It's there in his medical dissertation when he's a very young man, just graduating from the University of Basel. And the word possession is in one of the last essays that he wrote to an audience of medical doctors, and he's talking about schizophrenia. So what I meant by linchpin, the other metaphor I used was that it's like a through line in the collected works. You can see that he's always hanging on to that word possession to describe phenomenologically our experience of the unconscious possessing us, whether for good or for bad, being gripped by a complex, being possessed by an archetype. And his question is, what do we do with that experience? Whether it's an inflation, a negative inflation, whether it's an inspiration, how do we respond to being possessed? And how does the archetype feel? It's an odd way to say it, but how must the archetype feel being diminished into one tiny human body, sort of like God trying to fit himself into the body of Christ, which it must have felt like a diminishment.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to, since we only have an hour, I wanted to go over each of your books a little bit, and for you to tell the listeners a little bit about it. After Possession came out, and I do want to mention that you came out with a revised edition a few years ago. Why did you decide to revise Possession?
Oh, because it's an interdisciplinary book. There's a chapter on possession in the history of religion. There's a chapter on possession in anthropology, and there's a chapter on possession in psychiatry. And after I published the book, The DSM-5 replaced the DSM-4, and there was an attempt by the American Psychiatric Association to introduce possession into the DSM-5. And so I was really interested in why American psychiatrists wanted to co-opt this word, and what were they doing with it? So I revised the book simply to include the discussions which the psychiatrists held as they were trying to bring the word possession into the DSM.
That's fascinating. Would you tell us just a little bit more about that before we move on?
Well, I was at first excited because I thought, maybe they're going to get a little closer to Jung in understanding the experience of an archetype. But what I realized eventually in the discussions was that they were using it only to describe the experience of being possessed in other cultures, when you run amok, or when you go berserk,
right.
But they relegated it all to other cultural contexts. Nothing like that could happen to you in the United States.
Yeah.
So it was a missed opportunity.
Right. So your next book is one that John Beebe, who I had as my guest a couple months ago, mentioned, is Anteros, a Forgotten Myth. And you explore how the myth of Anteros, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, disappears and reappears throughout the centuries. So tell us a little bit about Anteros.
Well, Anteros, the book came out of my experience at the Jung Institute in Zurich. I heard a couple of analysts mention some paintings, Renaissance paintings, that depicted Anteros, who is the brother of Eros. And I looked at the paintings, and I wanted to understand what the paintings were about. So I went back to the Greek myths, and there were only a few references to Anteros in Greek mythology. And there seemed to be a total disconnect between the Greek myth and the Renaissance paintings. Mm-hmm. So I was very curious about that. The Greek myth is really very fascinating. There's a story that says that Aphrodite, who is the mother of Eros, notices that her son Eros cannot grow up. He stays a little boy with little tiny wings. And so she goes to her sister Themis, who is a Titan. So this is an Olympian goddess going to a Titan, going back in time to a previously more powerful godhead. And she asks her sister for advice. And her sister says, well, you must have a second child. It must be fathered by the god of war, Ares, and you will call the child Anteros. And as long as Anteros is around, Eros will grow. And so Aphrodite follows her sister's instructions. She and Ares, the god of war, make love. She gives birth to a second son, Anteros. And the myth says that as long as Anteros is present, Eros grows. But if Anteros goes away, Eros regresses. So there's something here about some insight about how love grows, which the Greeks were trying to understand. And the suggestion was that this Anteros, not anti, it's not the Latin anti, it's the Greek ant, meaning equal to Eros. This opposite, but this sibling rivalry creates growth. And so I started there, trying to just understand what the myth meant for the Greeks, and then moving forward, looking at those Renaissance paintings, which had puzzled me so much. And because there in the Renaissance, they took the myth of Anteros and Eros and set it up as an opposition between profane love and sacred love, giving the profane quality to Eros as carnal love and Anteros as spiritual love. That doesn't last very long. By the time you get to the Romantics, Anteros is carrying the negative, not the positive. And then he just sort of pops up from time to time. So, for example, Sir Alfred Gilbert in England in the modernist period sculpts that wonderful statue in Piccadilly Circus, which everybody thinks is Eros. But if you go back and look at his notes and his preparations, it's a statue to Anteros. And Sir Alfred Gilbert actually instructs his biographer and says, when you write about my life, designate the first part of my life as Eros and the second part of my life as Anteros. But so I mentioned that the myth is forgotten because, crowds walk by that statue of Anteros in Piccadilly Circus every day, and they don't know that it's Anteros.
Next, we have Philemon Foundation publication, or they actually don't publish. So Princeton University Press publishes. This was a project of the Philemon Foundation, which publishes the unpublished work of C.G. Jung, and you edited this volume. It's titled On Psychological and Visionary Art, Notes from C.G. Jung's Lecture on Gerard de Nerval's Aurelia. And I love this book. I was reading it this week, and it's really a beautiful book. It contains Alfred Kubin's illustrations, which I found to be very, very powerful, especially at this time. So tell us about your experience editing this book.
Well, I discovered in 1996 when I was in Zurich, I discovered Jung's lecture on Nerval's Aurelia in the special collections of the library of the ETH University. And when the editors of the collected works of Jung were making decisions about what to include and what not to include, they decided not to publish in the collected works Jung's lecture on Nerval. So Jung wrote a little abstract, a little 100-word paragraph that went into the collected works saying that he had written this lecture.
It's in volume 18, right?
It's in volume 18. It's just a little paragraph. So I read the lecture, the 1945 lecture, and I read the 1942 lecture, which Jung first wrote and presented to an association of psychotherapists. And then in 1945, he gave the lecture again at the Psychology Club, but a much revised lecture. So I was able to see at the special collections the 42 lecture, all of Jung's notes and the way he crossed out paragraphs and wordings, and then presented his ideas in a more reformed way in 1945. And I just thought it was a very important document because Nerval was one of the most important writers of the French Romantic period. He also was institutionalized 8 times for madness. And his doctor, Dr. Blanche, who was very progressive at the time, encouraged him to try to write his way out of his madness, to write an account of his madness as an attempt to get out of it. And that's, it's a very, very moving document. And so Jung was reading Nerval and responding to Nerval's personal history, but also to the fact that Nerval stepped into the collective unconscious. He wasn't just describing his personal unconscious. He had lucid experiences of going back in time, to the beginning of time, to the beginning of the universe, and so on. And he was totally lucid, and he was recording these experiences. So Jung was very moved by Nerval's text, because what he could see was that Nerval could not profit from the insights that he was recording, but that we as readers could. That Jung found very moving. That was a love project. I discovered the lectures in 1996, and it took me 20 years to get them published. It's just to get permission from the Jung family. They were very helpful, but it just took time. And then the Philemon Foundation wanted to do it as part of their series of unpublished works. So Sonu Shamdasani supported the project, and we submitted it to Princeton University Press. But it was a love project. I really enjoyed working on that material, and I'm so glad you liked the book.
Yeah, it really shows that it was a love project. It shows in the book, and just for the listeners, it contains a very long introduction by Dr. Stephenson, and also Jung's abstract on Nerval from the Collected Works, Volume 18, which I mentioned. And then in Part 3, it's Jung's lecture at the Psychology Club in 1945. And then Part 4 is the minutes of the discussion following the lecture. And then Part 5 is Jung's notes to the 1942 lecture. And Part 6 is Jung's first notes on Aurelia. And then Part 7 is Nerval's Aurelia with, as I mentioned earlier, Alfred Kubin's illustrations, which there's one on the cover, but they're throughout the end of the book, and they're so moving. They really struck me. So I hope everybody has a look at this book. Moving on, we're running out of time, but there are a couple more of your books. There are two more that I'd like to cover. The next one is Ages of Anxiety, Jung's Types as Inspiration for Poetry, Music, and Dance. And that was published in 2016. It was the part of the Zurich lecture series in analytical psychology, which is with ISAP Zurich, the International School of Analytical Psychology. And the lecture series used to be published by Spring Journal Books. It's now being published by Chiron Publications. But this was published by Spring Journal, and you might have a difficult time finding this book. I believe it's out of print. Is that correct?
Yes. Unfortunately, it is out of print.
Maybe it will be reprinted at some point.
I hope so.
Because this is fascinating as well. You look at how the poet W.H. Auden used Jung's typology to understand the effect of the Second World War on both individual and collective psyches. And I just want to mention this. There is a review of this book in the Fanez Journal, which is available for free online. I'll provide a link in the show notes. In Volume 3 of Fanez, Stephen Herman writes, in his review of this book, the type analysis in this book is the best and most creative part of the whole volume and should be studied by every Jungian because of its analytic focus on the newest advances in type theory and its practical usages, whether in analysis or art. So tell us a little bit about this book, if you would.
Well, it's a book about W.H. Auden, as you mentioned. He moved from England to New York City just at the beginning of the Second World War with a very conflicted, trying to understand what does a poet do during a time of war. And his poem, The Age of Anxiety, which is a book-length poem, a kind of narrative, is his answer to that question. And he tried to formulate his answer by casting four characters who as the four functions, and they meet in a bar in New York City and have a conversation, and then have a break, and then continue the conversation, and then they get in a taxi and go up to the Upper West Side to somebody's apartment and continue the conversation, and so you have the four functions talking to each other and trying to understand the moment when fascism is submerging the entire world. What is the role of the individual in society in such a moment? So I was very moved that Auden was trying to work this out in his poem. Then what I discovered was that Leonard Bernstein took the structure of the poem and wrote his Second Symphony using that structure. And so we have Bernstein, who I did not know until I was doing the research that he actually did a Jungian analysis.
I was going to ask you if he had, yeah.
Yes, he did. And so he's taking Auden's poem and this four-part structure, these four functions, and he's transposing this into music. Then I discovered that the symphony had been choreographed as a ballet 3 times by Jerome Robbins in New York City, by John Neumeier in Hamburg, the Hamburg Ballet, and most recently by Liam Scarlett in the Covent Garden Ballet, the Royal Ballet of Covent Garden. So I did some research on what each of the choreographers did with the dynamics, because they were working with 4 dancers. So the 4 dancers were representing the 4 functions. So I was just sort of tracking this creative thread in the lectures. I had a lot of fun with the lecture series because on the first night, rather than the lecture series takes place over a weekend in Zurich, a Friday night and all day Saturday. And it's a beautiful series set up by ISAP. And they were so supportive and so helpful. And so rather than lecture to the audience Friday night and all day Saturday, I invited a concert pianist, Victoria Hermantieva, and a second pianist, Benedict Horvath, to come, and they played Bernstein's Second Symphony transcribed for 2 pianos to the audience on the Friday night. And I have to say that I was so glad I didn't lecture on the Friday night and I just let them experience the music. It changed the whole quality of the question and answer periods. The audience was in a completely different place. So the book is the summation of those lectures.
Of those lectures. And I just would like to add, I forgot to mention that Auden's The Age of Anxiety, that book-length poem, won the Pulitzer Prize for poetry in 1948, 47, 48. So you have a new book coming out at the end of this year. It will be released by Routledge on December 6th, and I'm so excited about this book. It is titled The Correspondence of Victoria Ocampo, Count Keyserling, and C.G. Jung, Writing to the Woman Who Was Everything. And as I mentioned in the introduction, you will be doing a presentation, a performed reading of this book at the IAAP Congress in Buenos Aires, which is being held next month. So would you tell us what this book is about, and we'll go from there?
Okay. Yes, I'd be really happy to. It's a lovely project. The book is a description of two meetings. Victoria Ocampo, who was an Argentinian intellectual, and Hermann von Keyserling, who was a German philosopher. It's about their meeting in Versailles at the Hôtel des Reservoirs in 1929. And what happened was that Victoria Ocampo in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, wrote to Keyserling a series of letters, very effusive letters, telling Keyserling how much she admired his travel diaries of a philosopher. And so she was writing fan letters, but these were not just any fan. She had a publishing company. She was inviting him to come to Argentina, and she wanted to organize a tour of South America for him. And she was a very passionate reader. And Keyserling agreed to meet her at the Hôtel des Reservoirs in Versailles. But the meeting was a disaster because as much as she admired his writing, she was repulsed by the man physically. And he assumed that she was sexually available to him.
Oh.
So they met for a period of about 2 months every day. She honored her commitment to him to bring him to Argentina, to South America, to tour and write about his responses to the continent. She honored that commitment, but she was constantly having to fend him off. So there's a little bit of a kind of Me Too movement story here about Ocampo's position as a passionate reader, trying to make sense of, well, how do you fall in love with somebody's prose and not with the person? And this is a huge dilemma that she needs to work out and needs to understand in herself. The extent to which she is projecting her authority onto powerful male writers who know something about the power of words. And at the same time, Keyserling is totally enamored by Victoria Ocampo. And so what he does, he's a friend of Jung's, and so he writes to Jung for advice, and he's sending his accounts of his dreams to Jung and asking what he should do, because he's totally possessed, we would say, by the anima. And Jung advises him and tries to give him suggestions of what he should do. So that's one part of the story. The second part of the story is that after they break from each other, Keyserling and Ocampo, and Ocampo refuses to ever see him again, Ocampo goes to Zurich to meet Jung. And she wants to publish psychological types in Spanish. But there's this question that she has in the back of her mind, which is, does he know who she is from letters from Keyserling? So she's writing to him to ask to meet him, but she's saying sort of tentatively, maybe you know who I am, maybe you don't, maybe we have mutual friends. And at one point she actually asks him if she can do an analysis with him, and his response is very curious and slightly cold, and that can be interpreted in a number of different ways. So I was interested in these two meetings, these two moments, the moment when Ocampo meets Keyserling in the hotel, the moment when she travels to Zurich and meets Jung in his library, in his office. And the research that I did was to take those two moments and to find all the letters that preceded and that followed those two meetings. So in the book, the reader can read those effusive letters that Ocampo was writing to Keyserling in 1927, 1928. You can read the letters that Keyserling wrote to Jung asking for advice, and Jung's letters back giving advice. You can read the letters that Ocampo writes to Jung asking to meet him, and then what happens immediately after their very short meeting. And then towards the end of the book, before he dies, Keyserling writes his memoirs. And in his memoirs, he writes a chapter about Jung and a chapter about Victoria Ocampo as his anima. And Ocampo is so upset by this memoir because she feels it misrepresents who she is. And so she writes a book, a very short book, rebuttal, to say that, that was your projection on me, Keyserling, but this is who I am. And it's a beautiful statement of her individuation process. So the book is about these two meetings, or these two failed meetings, and about all the correspondence that leads up to those meetings and the correspondence that follows them.
I love it. This is so exciting. And I would like to add that Jung framed Keyserling's account of his encounter with Ocampo as, quote, one of the most beautiful animus stories I have ever heard.
Yes, this is very curious.
Wow. And then I would like to also read the, I don't know what to call it, the Dr. Singer, Tom Singer, the Jungian analyst Tom Singer, wrote a little, what do you call these that are usually printed on the back of the book?
An endorsement.
Thank you, an endorsement. He says, Craig Stephenson has the rare knack of taking a singular, often forgotten moment in history and mining it for unexpected riches. In this early 20th century whodunit, Stephenson shows himself to be a master psychological detective in his use of primary sources to uncover the unconscious dynamics of a fateful encounter between the animus of a wealthy South American heiress and the anima of a powerful, cultured European aristocrat. And he goes on, but I just wanted to mention that. So he calls this an early 20th century whodunit, and I love it. I'm so excited. I can't wait for it to come out. And I just want to say, too, everybody who follows me on social media will see that I have been posting the cover image. There's something about the cover of this book. It's a very simple drawing, but the colors in the drawing, and you had sent me the four
prototypes.
The four prototypes, and then the one that was decided on, which is my favorite color combination. But I am mesmerized by this cover. I'm just curious. Would you tell us a little bit about who designed it?
Oh, David Magellans, who's a designer in Mexico City. He worked from a photograph of Victoria Ocampo, But you're absolutely right. The simplicity of the figure drawing and the evocativeness of the colors.
Yes.
It's gorgeous.
It is. And I actually put all 4 of them together and in Photoshop and saved it as one image and put that in my Instagram stories so nobody can grab it. Those stories disappear after 24 hours, but I just can't stop staring at it. I love it. I can't wait for this book to come out. As I mentioned, next month you will be giving a special presentation, the performed reading with the 3 Argentinian actors. And isn't it interesting? I can't imagine this was planned, that this book involves this great Argentinian, woman, and it will be presented at the IAAP Congress, which just so happens to be held in Argentina.
Yes. Yeah. A happy accident.
A happy accident. So I will let you have the final word as we wrap up here. Is there anything I didn't cover? I don't know.
You're amazing, Laura. Thank you so much. I think we've taken quite a trip today, so I appreciate your questions very much.
Well, and thank you for staying with me. I know I tend to jump around, but there will be links to everything we discussed in the show notes for this episode at speakingofjung.com. So please visit that website, Speaking of Jung, that's JUNG.com, for more information on everything that was discussed here today. There you'll also find all of the previous episodes of this podcast, which are available to stream or to download for free. Speaking of Jung is also available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and on our YouTube channel, Jungian Laura. So with special thanks to Alexis O'Brien and George Russell at Routledge, and to Professor Sonu Shamdasani, I'm Laura London, and you've been listening to Speaking of Jung.